Dear colleagues, I've been wanting to research this topic for some time now. So during my MA, we were told that the first time simultaneous interpreting was used was during the Nuremberg Trials. I then went away and watched some videos. I watched some interviews conducted with interpreters from that time, and I read articles, and I found it absolutely fascinating. So I'd like to share a little bit about this with you today. As you know, in August in 1945, the Allies agreed that they would trial the Nazi war criminals. So they agreed that the trials to prosecute the Nazi war criminals should be carried out fairly and expeditiously. Now, those were two very important words. They had to be carried out fairly and expeditiously, which meant that simultaneous interpreting was absolutely necessary. The reason for this was that the trials had to be conducted in English, Russian, German, and French. What were the Nazi criminals being tried for? Well, it's kind of obvious, but they were charged with conspiracy to commit crimes against peace. They were charged with conspiracy to commit crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So those were the three charges. So the trials had to be conducted in English, Russian, German, and French, as I said. This was because obviously the defendants were going to be speaking in German and the defense counsel was going to be speaking in German. But then, of course, you had the American, British, Russian, and French judges and prosecutors. Without interpreters, these trials would virtually have been impossible. And interpreters were in many ways the unsung heroes of the Nuremberg Trials. But the Nuremberg Trials also led to absolutely groundbreaking developments in interpreting at the time. It led to what we now know as simultaneous interpreting. Now, the trials could have happened in consecutive mode. However, because of the language regime, the trials would probably have lasted 4 times longer than they actually did. The trials would probably have had to last multiple years if they'd been conducted in consecutive mode. This is because every line of testimonies, of questioning, of sentencing would have had to have been spoken at least 4 times in order to cover all the languages. Before the Nuremberg trials, various experiments had taken place. The Paris Peace Conference and the League of Nations had used either consecutive interpreting or chuchotage. There were other cases in which various speech texts had been pre-translated and were then given in the translated languages, in the target languages. On other occasions, speeches were actually given back in consecutive. So you'd have this weird situation where one leader, head of state or government, would be giving a speech. The speech would last for about an hour. During that hour, the interpreter would be taking consecutive notes, and then they would have to give the speech back, which would last another hour. So, of course, it was an extremely inefficient way of proceeding, which is why simultaneous interpreting had to be born. It was born out of necessity, essentially, for the Nuremberg trials. So it was Colonel Leon Dostert, who was a famous linguist and Eisenhower's personal interpreter, who came up with the idea. So Dostert was responsible for the system and also for recruiting interpreters for the Nuremberg trials. He consulted with IBM, the company IBM, and together they developed this system of microphones and headsets, so the system that we know today. He was also in charge of recruiting interpreters and testing them as well. And I find it quite funny the way he tested the interpreters for the Nuremberg trials. Basically, the interpreters had to name 10 trees, 10 car parts, and 10 farm tools in 2 languages in order to pass the test to be able to interpret at Nuremberg. Then there were also tests to do with general knowledge. Their knowledge of military terminology and legal terminology was tested. Their resilience to stress was tested. But it's a bit about the tree species and the car parts, which I find quite humorous, actually. Anyway, Dostert recruited these interpreters. He recruited a lot of British, American, French, German, and Soviet interpreters. And after he recruited them, he then lugged all these 600 headsets over to Nuremberg. Nuremberg had been pretty much destroyed during the war on account of the Allied bombings. So there were many logistical and technical issues. It was very hard for them to get the system working, but eventually they got it working. And then they performed these mock trials. So initially they started with 700 tested interpreters, and they basically whittled them down until there were only 36 left. A very small percentage actually passed the mock trials because the stress was extreme and the mental strain was absolutely colossal. You may have even seen pictures of the booths that were used at the time. They were very rudimentary. They were walled in on the front and on the sides by glass, but the top was completely open and there was absolutely no soundproofing. So interpreters were in this really difficult situation because they had to make sure they could hear properly, but they weren't able to talk too loudly. So they weren't able to interpret too loudly in case they disrupted the proceedings. So you had this slightly awkward situation. So there were 5 channels. You had the floor, which was channel 1, English, which was channel 2, Russian, which was channel 3, French, channel 4, and German, channel 5. And the trials began, and they lasted for 10 months, which was in total 210 days. There was so much material that actually all of the documents actually made up 42 volumes. And the Nuremberg Trials are actually known as the trial of 6 million words because there were so many documents, there were so many testimonies. As you can imagine, there were many testimonies given by witnesses and people who had experienced the horror of the concentration camps and the occupation themselves, who had given these testimonies and provided documents. And of course, all these documents had to be translated into all of the languages. So there was a translation team as well as an interpretation team. When I was researching this, I was really surprised because the shifts at the Nuremberg trials were actually of 85 minutes. So you can imagine how exhausting it would be, because often you'd be on mic for essentially 85 minutes without stopping. Sometimes it wasn't that bad because, for example, the idea was that you were meant to interpret only into your A language, and you were obviously only meant to interpret the source languages that you had in your combination. And you would be in a team of 3 interpreters. So, for example, if there was a language being spoken on the floor that you didn't understand, you could hand the mic over to your colleague. But nevertheless, there are actually examples of interpreters being on mic for 85 minutes in that high pressure, high stress context. So on the 20th of November 1945, simultaneous conference interpreting was officially born. Interpreters were literally charged with writing history, or rather interpreting history. So the justice machine was set in motion. And it has to be said that interpreters were one of the main forces actually in these trials. The task ahead of them and the responsibility, as you can imagine, were absolutely colossal. But what was it actually like? What was it actually like to interpret at Nuremberg? Well, just imagine it. You're literally interpreting history. You're literally part of history shaping itself. And you're literally part of arguably the most important trials of the whole 20th century. You're exposed to this horrific content as well. You're hearing and even interpreting about the most despicable evil acts that humanity has ever committed. But you can't think about that. You can't get emotionally involved. You can't get emotionally attached in any way, because you have to focus on the accuracy of what you're saying. And you have to focus so hard, because any mistake at all can alter proceedings, or it can have an impact on the sentences being handed down to these 24 criminals. Some interpreters described the Nuremberg trials as a veritable baptism of fire. And one actually said that it was a question of sinking or swimming. And she just decided to swim because she had no other option. She was thrown in at the deep end, and all she could do was switch on the mic and give it her best shot. But you can imagine it, because these interpreters had to deal with this often very complex legal terminology, military terminology. They were having to pour through, as I say, 43 volumes of documents. And the documents were so numerous that not all of them could be translated into all of the languages, because the translators simply didn't have time to interpret the documents. They were working round the clock, and they simply didn't have the time to do all of it. Now, of course, there were also some extremely sad stories which came out of the Nuremberg trials on the interpreting side, because some of the interpreters had actually been the victims of Nazi concentration camps, or they were the children of victims, and sometimes the psychological strain was just too much, as you can well imagine. And actually what they did was, when the psychological strain got too much, they would transfer the interpreters to the translation unit, and they would replace them with people from the translation unit as well. So there was a bit of back and forth between the translation unit and the interpretation unit, due to the fact that the psychological strain was just too much quite often for the interpreters. So they would switch with the translators sometimes. There was actually one young graduate from the Geneva School of Interpreting who had been contracted to take part in the Nuremberg trials, and she was actually Jewish by birth. During her tests, she had shown the most incredible potential, but when it came to turning on the mic, she actually just froze and couldn't say a single word. She couldn't utter a single word. And later, she told the senior interpreter that she had just been unable to work because she had in front of her these people who had been responsible for the most unabashed evil, and it was too much. It was too much, and you can hardly blame her. But not only that, but often the German war criminals would actually criticize the work done by the interpreters in order to get off the hook, if you like, or to distract attention from their own actions. One of these was the famous Hermann Goering, who was actually termed defendant number 1. I'm sure you've all heard of Hermann Goering. But he would often criticize the interpreters, and actually he understood English very well. So he would make a point of correcting the interpreters in order to undermine them, in order to undermine the Allies. Ribbentrop was also fluent in both English and French, so he would also make a point of supposedly correcting the interpreters. Sometimes the Nazis would even try and show off their education. Sometimes they would use language skills in order to soften what they considered to be a harsh translation of written statements which exposed the barbarity of their crimes. And some would even simply take off their headsets to make a point, to try and undermine the interpreters and the Allies. So you can imagine how emotionally demanding the task was for the interpreters. Goering actually famously advised his fellow defendants to complain about the interpreting when they got unpleasant questions. So when they were under fire in the box, they were told to criticize the interpreters as a way of gaining time and distracting attention from what they had actually done. There were also arguments over individual words, the translation of individual words. One particular incident was when one of the witnesses was describing the liberation of Poland by the Soviet armed forces, and the German word could either have been translated as occupation or seizure in Russian, and the word chosen was seizure, I think. And so the Soviet interpreters interpreted the German word into Russian as seizure, which led to a massive furor. In fact, it led to such a furor that the proceedings actually had to be stopped. And then eventually it was decided that the word seizure should be replaced by liberation in the documents. So that gives you an idea of how much was at stake here, even to the level of the individual word, and what a huge impact the slightest nuance or the slightest mistake could have. There were also many comparisons that we can see between acting and interpreting. There was one incident, for example, where a Russian interpreter got so engrossed with what she was interpreting that she actually found herself having an angry shouting match with one of her colleagues. She was still interpreting while she was doing this, but she found that she got so engrossed in it, so almost emotionally connected to the material, that she actually found herself rising up from her chair and almost having a shouting match with one of her colleagues. Another very interesting anecdote, and this will be the final one, was when the German interpreter was in charge of interpreting Goering's sentence. And you can imagine how hideously stressful that must have been. But the interpretation system that Goering had criticized so much eventually decided to take its revenge on him at the very moment where his sentence was going to be handed down. So the exact moment when his sentence was about to be read out, the judge started to read, and Goering signaled that he couldn't hear anything through the headphones. So the system had just simply gone down because of a technical issue. The technicians then solved the problem, and then defendant number one eventually learnt his fate. But you can imagine the emotional strain and the stress the interpreters were under, especially when they were reading out these sentences for the Nazi war criminals. So in conclusion, the trials, as you know, had a huge bearing on the course of history. In fact, the impact was so profound that actually the Nuremberg Trials and the legal principles of the Nuremberg judgment were codified by the UN into various documents. Ones that come to mind are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So we can see the profound impact of the trials. After the trials, many interpreters went to work for the UN, and their names were written in the annals of history, and quite rightly so. They had a huge impact on proceedings, and without them, it is doubtful that the trials could even have taken place. But it was there in the main courtroom of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice that simultaneous interpreting was born. It was there that simultaneous interpreting proved to the world that such a form of interpreting could exist and could be viable. But in conclusion, I just want to leave you with a quote, which I find quite profound and almost quite moving, actually. And it's this: that 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of law, is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. Thank you for listening.